Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, if you've been feeling completely exhausted, overwhelmingly numb, or honestly just burnt out by keeping up with the news lately, I need you to know that you are definitely not alone. Today, we're going to break down a really fascinating analysis from RJ Starr's essay, The Closed Circuit of Public Reality. We're going to figure out exactly why the modern information environment leaves so many of us feeling this way, and we'll look at the actual visual structures that map out our public reality.
We so often point the finger at a specific TV network, or maybe a certain political party, or we just kind of throw our hands up and assume journalism has lost its way. But what if our fatigue isn't really about bias at all? What if it's actually a psychological adaptation to this hidden structural loop that dominates how public information is produced?
All right, so here is the game plan for today. We'll break this down into 5 parts. 1. The closed circuit. 2. When meaning becomes noise. 3. The habit of absent attention. 4. Identity over understanding. And finally, the cost to our minds.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the closed circuit.
Okay, so at the macro level, legacy media and national politics have essentially fused together into a single interpretive machine. And here's the self-sustaining loop they're trapped in. Step 1. Politicians produce events or, symbolic gestures. Step 2. The media takes those events and converts them into a narrative which is usually framed as some sort of massive crisis or scandal. Step 3. Politicians and consultants react to that narrative. And then Step 4. Commentators spin the reaction. This just loops endlessly, and the wild part is, it often happens before the original event is even properly understood.
Now, the absolutely crucial point to understand here is that this is emergent distortion. It is not a conspiracy. There's no shadowy group in a smoky room orchestrating all this. Actually, it's just what naturally emerges when politics literally needs attention to survive and media needs conflict to keep its audience. So these institutions end up staging this elaborate performance basically for each other, while just using the public as a prop.
Which brings us to Section 2, when meaning becomes noise.
Because this closed circuit relies on constant manufactured urgency just to keep running, the actual information we get degrades into what the essay calls noise. And noise isn't the absence of information, right? It's information without usable proportion. It happens when the signals we're getting carry an emotional intensity that massively exceeds their actual practical relevance to our daily lives.
And honestly, you can see how this manifests literally everywhere on our screens. Breaking news banners, they don't even interrupt us anymore. They've just become this weird background atmosphere. Think about it. A red breaking news graphic used to mean a historical event was happening, and now it usually just means someone fired off a tweet. There's this constant emergency framing and daily predictions of a complete institutional meltdown. The problem is that repetition fundamentally changes meaning. When every single update is shouted at you as an urgent moral emergency, that repetition totally strips away the actual importance of the information.
All right, let's move on to Section 3, the habit of absent attention.
So how do our brains actually handle this relentless environment of noise? Well, we develop a protective habit that this analysis calls psychologically absent attention. And I guarantee you know this feeling. It's exactly what happens when you leave a cable news network on in the background just for the familiar rhythm, or you scroll through a morning newsletter without actually absorbing a single word. You remain in measurable contact with a news product, sure, but inwardly, you are completely unavailable to it.
Here's the real kicker. The whole system survives by completely misreading its own metrics. On one side, we have contact. That's your exposure, clicks, views, and just behavioral habits. But on the other side, we have true engagement, which actually requires trust, comprehension, and reflective judgment. The media machine treats mere contact, like a mindless click or an open tab or an angry share, as if it were genuine, intellectual engagement.
Which leads to this truly brilliant quote from the text. The audience remains present enough to be counted and absent enough to resist being changed. Wow, that perfectly captures our psychological withdrawal, doesn't it? We scan without surrendering and we listen without believing, basically just to protect ourselves from the sheer exhaustion of all these overinflated events.
Let's look at Section 4, identity over understanding.
So if we aren't really engaging with the news to understand reality, what are we doing? Just look at the contrast here. High-quality journalism asks our minds to slow down. It tolerates ambiguity and revises premature conclusions. But in the closed circuit, identity-driven media totally wins out. It offers immediate moral alignment. It efficiently tells us exactly who we are in relation to an event, confirming our group identity rather than, actually clarifying the facts. When public information is constantly routed through this filter of identity maintenance, it really forces our minds into these rigid patterns. In our minds, perception is filtered strictly through repetitive narratives. Emotionally, outrage and dread just become normalized civic responses. To our identity, a simple disagreement suddenly feels like a literal threat to the self. And for meaning, well, public life is permanently framed as a chronic crisis.
Ultimately, the closed circuit is rewarding rigidity over coherence. It actually rewards audiences for knowing in advance what a story means before they've even read past the headline. We are constantly encouraged to defensively reinterpret any new information to fit what we already believe, rather than staying mentally flexible and open when we're presented with new facts.
And finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, the cost to our minds.
Because our mental space is being constantly compressed by all this manufactured urgency, we start relying heavily on something called parochial attribution. To save mental energy because we are exhausted, we just rapidly sort unfamiliar, complex events into basic prepackaged political boxes. We do this simply so we don't have to deal with the heavy cognitive load of actually evaluating reality.
The deepest cost of all this isn't just political polarization or a lack of trust in institutions. It's an actual structural deformation of our attention. We're learning to just scan rather than to dwell. We react instead of integrating new facts. We've become incredibly intimate with the signals, the flashy banners, the phone alerts, the daily outrage, but we are left utterly starved of actual meaning.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought to really chew on. A society cannot think clearly when its institutions confuse stimulation with importance. How can we possibly expect to think clearly about our world when the very institutions built to interpret it for us can no longer tell the difference between mere stimulation and true importance? It's definitely something we all need to keep in mind the next time we check our feeds. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning what you see out there.